Bishop Athanasius Schneider has published a lengthy theological essay directly addressing the SSPX Excommunications, and he opens it not with commentary on July 2026 at all, but with a story from the year 357. It is worth understanding that story in full before anything else, because Schneider builds his entire argument on top of it. In the 4th century, Pope Liberius, after signing an ambiguous formula of faith that omitted the crucial doctrinal term consubstantial, commanded Saint Athanasius of Alexandria to enter into communion with Arian and semi-Arian bishops, the same bishops the Pope himself, under pressure from the Emperor, had unfortunately already entered into communion with. Athanasius refused. According to Saint Hilary of Poitiers and other historical sources, the Pope then excommunicated him, accusing him of troubling the peace of the Church. Despite that excommunication, Athanasius continued governing his diocese in Alexandria, and he even showed understanding for Liberius's own regrettable conduct, rather than attacking him personally. Liberius's successor, Pope Saint Damasus, later thanked Athanasius and consulted him directly on the affairs of the Eastern bishops. History's eventual verdict is stark. Liberius became the first pope never canonized. Athanasius was not only canonized, but declared a doctor of the Church. Schneider makes a specific and pointed observation here. By the current Code of Canon Law's own definition, Athanasius would today be considered schismatic, because he refused communion with bishops who were, at that moment, canonically recognized and subject to the Pope. Schneider's argument is that the SSPX consecrations of July 1, 2026, represent an instance of that same rare and specific dilemma. Preserve the unambiguous integrity of the Catholic faith as it has always been taught, or receive canonical recognition from a pope whose recognition currently comes attached to conditions requiring acceptance of what Schneider calls newly introduced doctrinal ambiguities in certain non-definitive teachings of the Second Vatican Council and in the post-conciliar magisterium, along with acceptance not merely of the validity but of the full correctness of the new Mass, despite what he describes as its doctrinal and ritual vagueness. Before going further into his specific application to the SSPX, it is worth laying out the theological framework Schneider constructs, because the argument depends entirely on distinctions he takes considerable care to draw precisely. He identifies what he calls unhealthy developments within the Church over recent centuries. Legalism, the tendency to treat legal and canonical form as nearly absolute. And papalism, the tendency to absolutize the person of the Pope and obedience to him beyond what the Church has traditionally required. Both, he argues, have come to be prioritized over the more fundamental necessity of unambiguity in matters of faith and liturgy. Yet during every genuinely great doctrinal crisis in Church history, he writes, the governing principle was always to avoid doctrinal ambiguity at any cost, citing the historical case of Pope Honorius I, whose doctrinally ambiguous letters, issued as part of his ordinary magisterium, were later firmly condemned by subsequent popes and by 3 separate ecumenical councils, despite a later attempt by Pope John IV at a kind of early hermeneutic of continuity, defending his predecessor. Schneider's central claim is that within the contemporary Church, obedience to the Pope has been elevated to a status that risks placing it on the same level as obedience to divine revelation itself, collapsing an important distinction Catholic theology has always maintained. Positive law, meaning disciplinary laws enacted by human ecclesiastical authority, is genuinely distinct from divine law, the truths of faith actually revealed by God. No Catholic may contradict divine law and remain Catholic. But in truly extraordinary and rare circumstances, Schneider argues, a Catholic may be required in conscience to act contrary to positive law precisely in order to remain uncompromisingly faithful to divine law. This brings him to the concept of schism itself, which he argues has not been fully clarified in its concrete practical application. Canon 751 defines schism as the refusal of submission to the Roman Pontiff or of communion with the members of the Church, subject to him. Schneider argues that a very narrow reading of this canon has emerged in recent Church history, one that virtually equates any material disobedience to the Pope, regardless of the underlying intention behind it, with formal schism in the full theological sense. He distinguishes this from what he calls a genuine state of formal schism, meaning the rejection in principle of papal authority through the establishment of a separate hierarchy, as occurred with the Greek Orthodox Church in 1054, and later with the various sedevacantist groups that persist to this day. One cannot speak of formal schism in that full sense, he argues, as long as supernatural faith in the dogma of papal primacy and infallibility persists, along with a genuine desire to live in concrete submission to papal authority, even when an extraordinary crisis within the Church temporarily prevents that submission from being fully realized in practice. He extends this same historical argument to the specific requirement of a papal mandate for episcopal consecrations. For a very long period in Church history, he notes, episcopal ordinations were carried out without direct papal involvement, with particular churches expressing communion with the Pope in various other ways. Only later did popes require papal mandate for every consecration. Even after that development, Schneider argues, canon law never classified illicit episcopal ordinations, meaning those performed against the Pope's explicit will, as intrinsically evil acts or as inherently schismatic in themselves. The norm requiring papal mandate, he insists, is a matter of positive law rather than divine law, precisely because it was not observed universally throughout the Church's entire history without exception. He readily acknowledges that a papal mandate is ordinarily necessary and was wisely established to secure the hierarchical submission of bishops to the Pope. But he argues the extraordinary nature of the current crisis is revealed precisely in the fact that a community whose defining characteristic is fidelity to the Pope now faces what he calls a genuinely tragic choice: obey the Pope and thereby be forced to accept uncertain and unclear aspects of doctrine and liturgy, or disobey him in a matter of grave importance, specifically the consecration of bishops, with the sole intention of preserving the means to transmit the faith and liturgy in their full integrity, as a service to souls and, he insists, to the whole Church, including the papacy itself. Schneider does not stop at defending the specific act of July 1st. He traces what he calls the roots of the current crisis back 60 years to what he describes as vague and ambiguous doctrinal statements of the Second Vatican Council that have, in his assessment, sown confusion. He points specifically to doctrinal relativism arising from certain approaches to ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, which he argues have contributed to obscuring the uniqueness of Jesus Christ and his Church as the sole way of salvation, a concern this channel has already documented in earlier coverage of Cardinal Sarah's own remarks on Cardinal El-Qassis's appointment and the Abu Dhabi document. He also points to what he calls doctrinal and ritual flaws in the liturgical reform itself, describing certain Protestantizing tendencies that he says have obscured the Mass's central sacrificial nature and its Christocentric focus. a concern directly paralleling this channel's earlier coverage of Cardinal Roche's own public statements about the Church's theology having changed since the Council. To support this reading, Schneider invokes St. John Henry Newman, quoting Newman's observation that bishops, when not teaching formally ex cathedra, may err, exactly as happened in the 4th century when Pope Liberius signed an ambiguous formula and a majority of bishops assembled at Rimini did likewise, and yet the Church's infallibility remained intact, specifically in her formal ex cathedra decisions, not in every act or statement of every bishop or even every pope acting outside that specific and narrow charism. Schneider then quotes a considerably more recent voice, Bishop Rudolf Graber of Regensburg, writing more than 50 years ago, in words Schneider says, describe the present situation even more precisely than they described his own era. What happened over 1600 years ago is repeating itself today, Graber wrote, but with 2 or 3 differences. Alexandria is today the whole universal church, whose stability is being shaken. And what was once carried out through physical force and cruelty has now been transferred to a different level. Exile is replaced by banishment into the silence of being ignored. Killing is replaced by assassination of character. This specific line, assassination of character replacing physical killing, deserves to be weighed carefully against everything this channel has already documented across its coverage of this ongoing controversy. It connects directly to patterns already examined in earlier episodes, from the sweeping and imprecise language in the July 2nd explanatory note that this channel showed produced genuine pastoral confusion among ordinary faithful who were never individually excommunicated, to Cardinal Roche's own public characterization of those attached to the traditional Mass as needing to ask whether they are really Catholic or rather Protestant, a statement this channel examined in detail in a previous episode. Schneider's argument is that these are not isolated rhetorical excesses, but part of a coherent pattern, one in which formal doctrinal condemnation has been replaced by a softer but equally effective mechanism of institutional marginalization and reputational damage. Schneider's central claim about the SSPX's actual function within the contemporary Church deserves to be stated in his own terms rather than summarized loosely. He describes the society as virtually the only community within the Church today that openly and consistently draws attention to what he calls the evident doctrinal ambiguities present in certain conciliar statements and in the rite of the new Mass, calling specifically for their clarification and, where necessary, their amendment, in accordance with what he describes as the constant magisterium of the Church across all prior centuries. He is careful here to distinguish this position from a rejection of Vatican II's actual dogmatic content, which the SPX has never disputed, and to frame it instead as a call for greater precision regarding specifically those documents and passages the Council itself explicitly identified as pastoral rather than dogmatic in character, a distinction this channel has already examined in earlier coverage of how Sacrosanctum Concilium's own text compares with what actually followed it in practice. He then offers a specific criticism of what he calls the hermeneutic of continuity, the interpretive approach, championed especially under Pope Benedict XVI, that reads the Council and its aftermath as continuous with prior Catholic tradition, rather than as a rupture from it. Schneider does not reject this approach outright. He explicitly calls it in itself valid and helpful. But he argues it can also become, in his words, a kind of straitjacket, one that merely covers over cosmetically the wounds caused by genuine doctrinal and liturgical ambiguity and confusion. requiring, in effect, a kind of circular reasoning in which everything is declared to be in order, provided one makes sufficiently strenuous intellectual efforts to demonstrate it. Through its tireless insistence on doctrinal and liturgical clarity, he argues, the SSPX renders what he calls a great service to the entire Church, one of genuine historical value, and he suggests that if the Holy See were to take that specific insistence seriously rather than dismissing it, doing so would mark, in his words, the beginning of the end for what he calls the modernist project within the Church, a project he dates back more than a century, well before the Council itself. To make this argument accessible beyond strictly theological terms, Schneider offers an extended parable that deserves to be quoted at length because its specific structure carries the full weight of his argument. A fire breaks out in a great house. The fire chief permits only the use of new firefighting methods, even though these have proven less effective than the old, tested tools. A group of firefighters defies that order, continues using the older and proven methods, and even recruits new firefighters to join them, despite the fire chief's explicit prohibition. And in many places, the fire is actually contained. Yet these firefighters are branded disobedient and schismatic, and punished accordingly. The fire chief then admits only those firefighters who acknowledge the new methods and obey the new regulations. But given the sheer scale of the fire and the insufficiency of the official methods, other helpers intervene anyway, bringing genuine skill and good intentions, and in the end help save the very house the fire chief was struggling to protect. Eventually, historical circumstances shift, and a new fire chief emerges, one who recognizes the unfortunate effects of the newer methods, restores permission to use the old ones, becomes their champion himself, and welcomes back the firefighters once punished and expelled as rebels. What had once been condemned as disobedience is revealed, in the end, to have been an act of selfless commitment. This parable functions as Schneider's own implicit prediction about how the current SPX controversy will eventually be judged by history, and it deserves to be weighed with the same critical care this channel has applied throughout its coverage of every claim in this ongoing story. It is, on its own terms, a prediction rather than an argument, and its persuasive force depends entirely on accepting the underlying premise that the newer liturgical and doctrinal approach has, in fact, proven less effective than the older one it replaced, a claim this channel has examined through actual documented evidence across multiple prior episodes, from the French monastery closure data to the Fraternity of St. Peter's record ordination numbers, to the national study of Catholic priests showing a dramatic generational shift toward conservative self-identification among younger clergy. Those documented trends lend real, evidence-based weight to Schneider's parable in a way that abstract theological argument alone could not. Schneider closes his essay by invoking two considerably older authorities, deliberately choosing voices that predate the current controversy by many centuries, precisely to demonstrate that the pattern he describes is not novel to this specific moment. He quotes St. Augustine's treatise on true religion, describing a category of good men whom divine providence sometimes permits to be driven from the visible congregation of the Church by what Augustine calls the turbulent seditions of carnal men. Such men, Augustine writes, for the sake of the Church's peace, patiently endure that insult or injury and attempt no novelties in the way of heresy or schism. They form no separate conventicles of their own, but defend to the death and assist by their testimony the faith they know is preached in the Catholic Church, even from outside its ordinary visible structures, and the Father who sees in secret crowns them secretly. Augustine himself notes this is a rare kind of Christian, but insists examples are not lacking across the Church's long history. And Schneider closes with Athanasius's own words, written to his brother bishops throughout the world amid his own 4th-century crisis of faith, words Schneider explicitly applies to the present moment. The canons and decrees of the Church were not given at the present day, Athanasius wrote, but were rightly and steadfastly transmitted to us from our forefathers. Neither had the faith its beginning at this time, but it came down to us from the Lord through his disciples. That, therefore, the ordinances which have been preserved in the churches from old time until now may not be lost in our days, and the trust which has been committed to us be required at our hands. Rouse yourselves, brethren, as being stewards of the mysteries of God, on seeing them now seized by aliens. Schneider ends not with condemnation but with an act of hope stated in explicitly theological terms. God, in his providence, writes straight, even with lines that, from a merely legal perspective, appear crooked. May he grant that this day comes soon. Let us be joyful amid tribulation, and say, I believe in the invincibility of the Church and of the papacy, and I believe that the Holy See will one day shine forth again as the citadel of truth before the entire world. What deserves to be said plainly, in bringing this analysis to a close, is that Schneider's essay represents one of the most theologically sophisticated and historically grounded defenses of the SPX's canonical position that this channel has encountered across its entire coverage of this ongoing controversy. It does not deny that a genuine crisis exists in the Church's own canonical and disciplinary structures. It does not deny that the July 1st consecrations violated positive ecclesiastical law as that law currently stands. What it argues, with considerable historical documentation behind it, is that the distinction between violating positive law under conditions of genuine necessity and committing the kind of formal, doctrinally grounded schism the Church has always condemned in the strongest terms, the kind exemplified by the Eastern Schism of 1054 or by contemporary sedevacantism, is a real and theologically significant distinction that the current application of Canon 751 may be collapsing too readily. This does not settle the question definitively, and it should not be received as though it did. Reasonable and faithful theologians, including some this channel has already covered extensively, from Cardinal Burke's more measured criticism to Bishop Eleganti's institutional concerns, to Cardinal Roche's own stated defense of liturgical unity as the governing priority, would each respond to different specific elements of Schneider's argument in different ways, and some would push back forcefully on his central historical analogy to Athanasius, arguing the 4th-century Arian crisis and the current liturgical and doctrinal disputes are not genuinely comparable in scale or in kind. What Schneider's essay does accomplish, regardless of where any individual listener ultimately lands on its conclusions, is to place the entire SPX controversy within the deepest and most serious theological framework the Catholic tradition possesses for evaluating exactly this kind of crisis. Rather than allowing it to remain a matter of competing press releases, canonical technicalities, and diocesan letters examined in isolation from the 2,000-year history within which the Church has always understood such moments to belong. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.